Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're diving into an absolute masterclass. We are going to unpack a text that quite literally reshaped postcolonial studies, Edward Said's groundbreaking 1978 work, Orientalism. We'll be exploring a radical and honestly pretty uncomfortable idea. We're looking at how Western knowledge production, things like philology, anthropology, and literature, didn't just innocently describe the East, but actively served as a strategic tool for imperial domination. It is a fascinating look at the intersection of scholarship and empire, so let's get into it. Here is our syllabus for today's explainer. 1. The knowledge power nexus. 2. Said's three frameworks. 3. Constructing the Orient binaries. 4. Philology to bureaucracy. 5. Silencing voices. And finally, 6. Study guide prompts. Section 1. The knowledge power institution for dealing with the Orient through a systematic knowledge power nexus. It wasn't just a few isolated scholars sitting in dusty rooms translating texts. It was this massive interlocking system spanning academic disciplines, literature, and colonial administration. To know the Orient was to possess authority over it. This knowledge fundamentally created dominion over subjects from Morocco all the way to Indonesia. Section 2. Said's three frameworks: academy, discourse, and hegemony. To really grasp Said's argument, we need to look at his three distinct interlocking frameworks. First, we have the academic discipline. Championed by figures like Sylvestre de Saussure in philology, this was all about meticulously categorizing Eastern languages and customs. Second, Said borrows Michel Foucault's concept of a discursive formation or episteme. Think of this as the invisible set of rules deciding what could and couldn't be thought or said about the East, basically creating it as an intelligible object. Finally, Said uses Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony, which is cultural and political dominance, to show how this discourse became a political instrument. It was directly applied to practical colonial control, like Lord Cromer's bureaucratic imperialism in Egypt. Section 3. Constructing the Orient binaries. Identity through negation. So, how did the West actually pull this off structurally? They did it by building rigid binaries. The Occident, leaning heavily on Western Enlightenment ideals, defined itself as rational, virtuous, mature, and dynamic. But, to maintain that pristine identity, they needed an opposite. So they projected stereotypic negations onto the East: irrational, depraved, childlike, and passive. This wasn't just name-calling. Enlightenment rationality required this static, childlike other to justify its civilizational duty. If the East was childlike, well, it naturally needed a mature European parent to step in and govern it, right?
And these binaries were deeply entrenched through what Said calls the textual attitude. 19th century scholars privileged prior texts, along with those heavily stereotyped maps and illustrations that came with them, over lived reality. Take Gustave Flaubert's Salammbô, which turned the East into a passive, eroticized, exotic spectacle. Or Edward Lane's Manners and Customs, which meticulously cataloged supposed moral laxity in Egypt. Ernest Renan's linguistic theories literally pathologized Arab minds as being arrested at an earlier stage of evolution. The actual empirical reality of the East became completely subordinated to these texts and drawings.
Section 4. Philology to bureaucratic domination, the imperial timeline. Let's trace the timeline here. How does this go from studying old languages to full-blown bureaucratic domination? It starts with early philology, like William Jones in 1786. But the massive paradigm shift happens in 1798, with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Napoleon brought along scientists and scholars who produced the monumental 40-volume Description de l'Égypte. They transformed a living, breathing society into classified objects: mummies, hieroglyphs, irrigation patterns. By the time the Royal Asiatic Society was founded in 1834, this systematized knowledge was primed and ready to train administrators, leading directly to Lord Cromer's governance by 1883. Which brings us to this staggering number: 7 million. Lord Cromer was the British consul general in Egypt, and he governed 7 million Egyptian subjects. Because Orientalist texts had so firmly established that Egyptians were fatalistic and immature wards, Cromer approached his administration as literally a parental responsibility over children. Academic analysis wasn't just theory anymore, it was the practical blueprint justifying permanent oversight of 7 million human beings. And this is where we ground all this philosophy in hard, cold imperial data. Colonialism was a machine extracting both knowledge and resources. Actually, think of Cromer's administrative reports almost like modern algorithmic data harvesting today. He extracted incredibly granular intelligence about Egyptian agriculture and society to ruthlessly optimize extraction. Egyptian cotton exports jumped from 1.3 million qantars in the 1880s to 3.5 million by 1900. It's the vicious circle of domination in action. Highly detailed data collection directly boosting colonial extraction. And that extraction, it resulted in a massive £8 million in annual British revenue. And what did they do with that cash? They funded further cadastral surveys and gathered even more data on the population and land to increase yields even further. Knowledge generates profit. Profit funds more knowledge production. Enhanced knowledge tightens control, yielding further profit. It is a perfectly tuned, self-perpetuating engine of empire. This perfectly leads us to an incredibly revealing quote from former British Prime Minister Arthur James Balfour during a 1910 House of Commons speech. He said, "We know the civilization of Egypt better than we know the civilization of any other country, but we know less than there is to be known." This captures Orientalism's circular logic flawlessly. Britain knows Egypt, therefore Egypt is exactly what Britain knows it to be. Therefore, Britain must occupy Egypt to manage it. Intellectual mastery naturalizes and absolutely justifies territorial conquest. Section 5. Silencing Voices Under Empire. The Discursive Closure. We absolutely have to look at the devastating human impact of this closed loop. Because Orientalist discourse completely essentialized the East as static, passive, and incapable of self-governance, it created what we call a discursive closure. When Egyptian nationalists like Mustafa Kemal demanded self-rule, British authorities didn't just disagree with them. His demands were considered ontologically impossible, meaning within their entire system of knowledge, an Egyptian capable of self-determination simply could not exist. The intellectual framework entirely silenced local political voices, making resistance literally unintelligible to the empire. Section 6. Study Guide Discussion Prompts. All right, as we wrap up this masterclass, I want to arm you with some crucial prompts for your own study or classroom discussions. First checkpoint. How did Napoleon's 40-volume Description de l'Egypte establish the textual attitude over lived experience? Think about the real dangers of prioritizing a cataloged, classified version of a society over the messy, empirical reality of the living people within it. Second prompt. In what ways did Lord Cromer's administration synthesize Foucault's discourse and Gramsci's hegemony? I challenge you to look back at the hard data of cotton exports and revenue we just discussed. How does the theoretical idea of controlling what can be said about a people directly translate into the practical, hegemonic extraction of their resources? And finally, I want to leave you with this one provocative thought to chew on. How does essentializing diverse populations into a single character continue to silence political self-determination today? Edward Said's critique doesn't just apply to the 19th century. When we reduce millions of complex human beings to a single, easily digestible stereotype, whose voices are we making unintelligible right now? Keep questioning the knowledge you consume and ask yourself, who does this knowledge truly serve? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.